to today's broadcast of North Idaho College Public Forum. The crew is comprised of NIC television students, and your moderator is North Idaho College political scientist Tony Stewart.
I welcome you to the fifth week in our series entitled Beyond Darkness, A Human Response. This has been and continues to be a very serious topic, and we're happy that you are tuning in so we can discuss how we may move on beyond darkness as a human race. Today I welcome to the program a long friend of many years and a former colleague, the mayor of the city of Coeur d'Alene, Ray Stone. He is not here in that capacity. He is here to talk about an earlier experience in his life. In fact, our subtopic today deals with a 20-year-old soldier's experience and view as he went into Germany to assist in the liberation in World War II of the concentration camps, among other things, while they were in Germany. Ray Stone holds a baccalaureate degree and also a master's from Whitworth College. He also served in the United States Army from February 1942 to January 1946. He was in the 82nd Airborne Division, and that's how he arrived in Germany to talk about the experience we'll talk about today. He's received a number of awards in his life for many different activities, and one of them was the Eisenhower Liberation Award in the spring of 1988 that deals with the subject we wish to talk about today. Mayor Stone, it's a pleasure to have you here with us, and we are happy that you took time to deal with what we know is a very serious topic, but we make progress by discussing those serious issues.
I'm pleased to be here. Thank you for asking me.
And to join me today in questioning our guests are two members of the panel. First of all is Janelle Burke, who is an attorney in the state of Idaho, and next to her is Steve Schenck, who is Dean of College Relations and Development at North Idaho College, and I shall ask Janelle Burke to commence the questioning.
Okay.
Well, let's begin right by setting the stage for our viewers. Tell us, what did you as a 20-year-old soldier do?
Well, I was a PFC. That's not very high rank, but I was a scout in an INR platoon in the 325th Glider Infantry Regiment, which was attached to the 82nd Airborne. Even though I was a jumper, probably half that regiment were jumpers as well as glider people. Sometimes they rode the gliders, and sometimes they used parachutes, and most of the time it was off the back end of trucks. And so in this particular platoon, we were, as I mentioned in the speech this morning, an intelligence and reconnaissance platoon. And so that was our mission, to have outposts, to scout, and also oftentimes to be out ahead of the other troops in order to send back reports of the resistance that we might have in certain areas. The particular time that we wanted to talk about today was the fact simply that I was on my third campaign in Europe, and I was a replacement, which is, as I mentioned this morning, is the lowest type of thing that you can be as a replacement in Europe during World War II, because you're cannon fodder is what you really are. But at any rate, we were crossing the Elbe River in northeastern Germany, and well, northwestern if you relate that to Berlin, but we crossed the Elbe River, and we're getting ready to meet the Russians. And so in that process, I'll go into more detail if you so desire. We went to a couple of villages, and we came to this town of Ludwigslust, Germany, which was a town very similar to the city of Coeur d'Alene in population size, probably about 15,000. A very well-kept town, a very clean town, with reasonably healthy-looking people who had been able to avoid most of the situations in the war that many German towns experienced, or cities experienced. And we did some directing of traffic, and we did some other things around the town when we first got in there after going through some processes. The whole 21st German Army group surrendered to my division, which means 150,000 people surrendered to 8,000, so there was a lot of directing of traffic to get, because the war was about over. At any rate, we were in the town probably 6 or 7 hours, and someone came along and said, we were directing some traffic down on the main street, and someone said, you go out to one of those camps, get in your Jeep and go out to one of those camps. And we went along, and Lieutenant Lozier, who was the interrogation officer, a Jewish, his affiliation, religion was Jewish, and he went out and in the Jeep ahead of us, and we followed him to give him some protection, because the place wasn't totally settled yet, and 4 miles away from Louis-lès, we discovered the Wobling concentration camp, and that was where the personal experience of being in a camp, that I first ran onto that.
Steve Shink.
Ray, tell us a little bit about that experience.
Well, it was a very traumatic experience, of course, and we weren't personally there very long, and we coming down the highway to the camp, and it was a double-lane paved highway out of the town of Louis-lès, and I said it was about 4 miles away. The first thing we noticed in our Jeep was the low silhouette buildings on the left side of the Jeep as we were traveling down the road. The barbed wire, non-permanent buildings, if I can recollect properly, although there were some that were not just made of wood. There were some other materials that made some of the buildings. We saw some people literally tied up in the wire, hanging on the wire. Obviously, as we learned later, we drove into the gate and went to, there were several barracks, maybe 8 to 10 rather large barracks. And when we drove in, there were probably, in the final total, there were probably 3,000 people still living, and probably 1,000 or maybe 500 dead and 500 more in the process of them dying. And we went at the other end of the camp and went into a barracks, and I have a picture of Lieutenant Lozier standing over some of the bodies and some of the people that were half alive and half dead, so as to speak. And we went to this barracks, this first barracks, and on each side of the barracks there were shelves in which there were about 6 heights, and on each side, and in some of those, between those shelves, we found people that were alive, and we found some that were dead. And they were, of course, the feces and the filth and the vomit, and was there, and it was absolutely a very depressing. It was a dark day that day anyhow, and we were in that barracks probably for 10 minutes trying to help some people and put them out in a position where they could be treated by the medics that we knew were coming. We stayed in that barracks, and then finally I think our platoon lieutenant said, don't worry about those people right now, come on out, we want to go check a couple of other barracks. We went rapidly through a couple of other barracks, and then we went over to another part. They said that for us to see if there were any gas chambers there, and there were not any gas chambers. Because we found out later it was a transitory camp where they gathered people together to send them to an extermination camp. We also discovered, and I discovered this when I was back east, receiving the Eisenhower Award, that some of the people in the camp came up to me, had been in the camp, came up to me on the platform afterwards and said, I was in that camp. There's a Rabbi Berkowitz in Church Falls, Virginia, I think it is. I'm not sure the exact town. He calls me every once in a while. We talk. He was a 12-year-old in that camp, and he called me when he knew I was going to be back east, and we talked. But there was a train leaving the camp with about 3,000 more people, and an American P-51 had knocked out the engine of that train so it couldn't move, and so they were left on the siding. Those people were somewhat more lucky because they got food earlier than the others. But many of the people, Steve, that were given food, and we left the camp shortly thereafter, went back downtown to do the traffic control. Many of those people died almost instantly when they started taking in the food because their stomachs were not they're not able to handle it physically, and there was perforation of the bowel system and the stomach system.
Ray, had the operation of that camp, was it continuing right up to the time you liberated?
Continuing at least 2 days before. The SS probably pulled out about 2 days before and gave and threw up their weapons, and maybe a day before even, and gave their weapons to the convicts, as you well know in the camps. And it's obvious in the pictures we have downstairs at Auschwitz and other places. There were civil prisoners there as well as political prisoners, as well as extermination people like gypsies or Jews that were going to be exterminated, and they left those machine pistols in the hands of the convicts, and the convicts had machine gunned a lot of the people who were attempting to get out of the camp at the same time. And we in a village previous to this, we found a lot of dead German soldiers, quite a number of dead German soldiers who had evidently been not killed by our troops necessarily, because we were out, I think, mostly ahead of most of the major part of the regiment. And I don't know about the 325's total impact, or the 505 or the 504. Those were both parachute regiments. But in our particular case, we found some soldiers that obviously might have been killed by people who had escaped from the concentration camp, or some of those other kind of prisoners.
Ray, there's so much to be learned from history, and so many historians, and you have a history background, and I didn't do this in the introduction, but you served as dean of the college
Yes.
for a long time, and that's when I had the privilege of working with you. And you and I have talked so many times about civil rights or human rights, and one of the subtopics in the program that really got my attention is it's entitled A 20-Year-Old Soldier's View of the Vicious Heart. And I'd like for you to spend a few minutes, because I know how strongly you feel about this, of talking about that there is evil in the world, and there are evil political movements, and you've told us the result of that, but would you take some time?
Yeah, sure, I'd be glad to. Of course there's evil in the world. Today, if you read the newspaper and if you watched the news the last couple of days, the Nazi Party, or the similar to a Nazi Party, is now on the rise again in Hitler and in Germany. And there is a former SS trooper that's in charge of that party, and they gained some seats in the legislature over there that they hadn't gained previously. And the other party, the one that thought they were going to win all the seats, were very complacent and let them get that. So the same thing, and people say, well, don't worry, there's not enough to worry about, but they said the same thing about Hitler. And I take that title of, a 20-year-old person's view of the inside the vicious heart from a book that Robert Abzug sent me, who wrote about terror, and he had done some research on the concentration camps, and he called it Inside the Vicious Heart. So I just sort of added to it by saying a 20-year-old person. And I think this is what takes place in that situation, is that in that town, for example, at that particular time at any rate, and this is now in East Germany, as you well know, I didn't find, and because we were just enlisted men, so to speak, that doesn't mean that we didn't do any thinking. And it was an impact on us because we didn't know about it ahead of time, what was going to take place. But we didn't find, and in my platoon, remember now, that we had lots of folks several folks that could speak German, several that could speak Polish, and some that could speak Italian and French, because we were an intelligence and reconnaissance platoon. I was one of the few people in there that did not speak a foreign language, probably one of 3 out of 15. It was a very small platoon, by the way. But everybody. So we visited with people, and we talked to them, and I had a fellow by the name of Larson, I think, from the Milwaukee area that was a fairly good friend of mine, and we had talked to people, and they did not acknowledge that there was harm done. They did not even wish to admit that the camp was even there. We went to this person's house, as I mentioned, and we went to the cellar. Larson and I did. The cellar was full of canned goods and canned meats. What kind of meat, I don't know, but and the house was pleasantly located, and the lady had certainly not lost any weight in the last 2 or 3 years, and so I don't think they were particularly bothered by it. But it's like as an analogy to that is that when you say to a child, for example, and you discipline and you say, look, you shouldn't have done this sort of thing, and they say, well, I'm sorry, and that's all they want to say. They think that takes care of the reason for doing it, and it doesn't take care of it at all. They would not accept, in my viewpoint, the responsibility, and I think that happened in Germany. I think that we had some people like Erich Bonhoeffer and other Protestants and the Catholic Center Party had made some resistance, and there were some people who were in the regime early in the days, if we read our history carefully, who were eliminated by the SA troops and by the SA troops. But all in all, the impact that Hitler had and Himmler and Goebbels with this strong propaganda, the German people accepted this without reservation. As a general group, there were some resistors, and there were some people, as I said, in the regime that resisted and didn't like the excesses that were taking place. But in reality, if you look at the pictures of the large rallies at Nuremberg, if you look at the pictures in Munich when they had the large rallies, and there was a lady movie producer who did a film, and I'm not sure the title of it, but had something to do with strength through joy type of thing. The German people were very, very pleased with this as a general group, very pleased with this resurgence of nationalistic power. And I think if we read even Jan Walton's book Out of the Night, that we understand that in the process that people do become immune to this. There was absolute viciousness. In our contacts in combat, and remember now, I don't consider myself to be a hero at all. I don't want that even implied. But in our contacts with army units, German army units, the Waffen-SS was by far the worst kind of troops that you could ever run up against. You wanted to avoid them more than anything. And then you take a Waffen-SS paratrooper, that was even worse. Because they had been in, the SS is indoctrinated that superior people and superior races. And so But the sad thing is that the indoctrination with the youth took place early, that, you know, the 10 to the 15s, and then another group, the 16 to the 18s. All that took a period of years. So the time they were ready for the army, the time they were ready for some kind of contribution, they'd been indoctrinated with this philosophy.
It shows the power of education. I had a professor of comparative government who had done in-depth research showing there was a lot of literature in Germany prior to Hitler that taught some of these ideas. So if we make a comparison with 1989, that's why the human rights movement in this country today, I think, spends so much time talking about education and how you must never assume that individuals will grow up without the prejudice and bigotry that they hear it, and if you don't counter it, those are the kind of results that history oftentimes have recorded.
Yeah. Well, we all recognize that all of us have some prejudices and personal viewpoints that probably to be considered prejudiced by other people, but this sort of thing in which you prey upon those people that are weak, when you put stars on people, when you make them give up their property, when you burn down their shops like they did on Kristallnacht on November 9th, I believe it was, in 1938, and November 10th. And so many Jewish synagogues were burned down. And when they made people, and you can see by the pictures, the little kids that were put to death, and you saw Jewish people, pictures of Jewish people, older folks having to scrub the streets with brushes, when you saw people, Jewish people in Warsaw having one half their mustache shaved off, and German soldiers standing around laughing. That's cruelty. And German, and American soldiers were cruel too at times, but not in the same way, I do not believe, in the same racially prejudiced or anti-religious viewpoint cruelty. That had been indoctrinated. Mein Kampf stated it when he wrote it in 1923, when Hitler wrote the book, My Struggle. He specifically stated we need a specifically strong leader, and the first germs of the racially purist theory came forward. Himmler, Goebbels, Goering all accepted that philosophy because they were, as we well know, were malcontents anyhow, and it was easy for them to accept that philosophy.
Janelle Burke.
Obviously, this had a great impact on your life. Can you tell us some of the ways that you think it has changed what you have done throughout your life?
Well, I think I can. Sometimes I wonder if I haven't avoided thinking about it oftentimes, and I want to say, Mrs. Burke, that many people, soldiers, American soldiers, have seen far worse than I have in relationship to camps. But at least I think it did do this for me. I don't know if there was any more traumatic experience I've ever had in my life. That's the first thing. Secondly, at the beginning, I was kind of numb about it, and we didn't eat very much. Several of us we saw them put them in DP camps, and we said, my God, they just got through getting them out of a concentration camp, and they put them back in camps. But knowing now that it was a necessary step to saving the lives and whatever might be. We were very depressed, but frankly, at that time, we were like the normal GI. We wanted to get the heck out of there and go home. And
you wanted to survive.
We wanted to survive. We were surviving to get out and go home. The war was over for us, and we knew that there were agencies that were going to take care of these people. And it didn't hit me until I came back and wanted to become a teacher, and I said to myself, if you're going to be a teacher, what are you going to teach about? What are you going to deal with? Well, of course, I was a history major, never taught history in my life. I taught American government. But in my American government class, when I first taught it in high school in central Idaho and also at Coeur d'Alene High School, I always told my students about this experience. As a matter of fact, I had one class write some people in Belgium who were very friendly to me, a very old family in Verviers, Belgium, and we received answers back from that old couple. And so I tried to, I think, recognize that the one thing that I could do as a teacher was, because of this experience, is that if people saw that there was injustice as they dealt with life's problems, and if people were being treated unfairly, they better be able to recognize what is just and what is not just in their dealings with the students or with their own life. And I thought I'd better do that sort of thing. So I tried to help them do that. That was one thing I wanted to do. Secondly, in relationship to that, if in fact they were able to recognize what was not just, that they better at the same time think about a plan of action to do something about that injustice and be willing to think about that plan. Thirdly, they had to commit themselves to taking care of that plan and getting themselves in a position to stand up for what was just. And then fourthly, I think in my teaching career, when I was in the classroom in particularly, I tried to teach them that in the final analysis, the opposite of Himmler's and Hitler's viewpoint, I think that love will solve many of our problems. Not all, of course. We can't be so naive that it's always going to take care of the problem, because sometimes you have to be really tough about these things. But the fourth thing was that to learn to love and care about other. And if you have that in your heart, then that other part is not going to touch you nearly as negatively. And that was the 4 points of philosophy about teaching that I tried to bring into my classrooms as I taught. And it affected me so much that that inside sometimes I was torn by that intense desire to have that happen with students, and when it didn't happen sometimes, I was mighty frustrated. But most of the time we were able to accomplish what we sought to do.
Steve,
I hope that answers your question.
Yes.
Ray, it won't be many years now before the Holocaust is 50 years behind us. Several generations in this country have grown up without any direct contact with it. Thankfully, we have people like you and many others who keep that memory alive. What's going to happen, though?
You're saying something really important.
What's going to happen in the future when no one directly remembers that experience?
Let me tell you an experience about the very thing you're saying. When we were back in Washington, D.C., when my wife and I were back there, and we were involved with General Gavin, who was an older man now. He was only 37 when he was a major general, the youngest infantry general in World War II, by the way. And so General Gavin was sitting there, and he has arthritis and has a problem here, and he's bent all over now. But he was a young and vivacious person. And Benjamin Meade, one of the co-chairmen of the National Holocaust Committee, was sitting across. We were having dinner. And then Rachel Haskell's cousin from Texas was also there, and his wife, and Betty and I, and Mrs. Gavin. And Benjamin Meade looked over at me, and he said, "You know what bothers me about this sort of situation? As I look across at you and I look at General Gavin and I feel my own neck, I think we're all getting chicken necks." And I said, "I know what you're saying. You're saying that we're growing older." And he said, "Who's going to carry on?" He asked that question. And well, what's taking place in the National Holocaust Committee has this building plan and this whole thing that they're, for example, the remarks that I made back there thanking the committee on behalf of the city of Coeur d'Alene, and because they awarded the city award too, all that was recorded. And so every time they have a program, every time they record it, and when this building is completed, 100 years from now, people will go into that memorial and they'll be able to hear throughout that whole memorial 100 years of voices of people who experienced the Holocaust, whether they were victims or whether they were liberators. Because you have to keep in mind the heritage that the Jewish people feel about this, that they continually keep having programs reminding their youth about the necessity for not letting anybody ever forget this. So I think what's going to be carried on is people like you that have had this second-hand experience, so to speak, will carry on and tell the folks that you know about. But somehow that National Holocaust Committee is going to take care of that. And then, as a matter of fact, I'm going back east very shortly and deal with this in the Quad Cities, and I'm going to speak to some grade schools about my experience as a Christian person in dealing with those people in those Jewish schools.
Do you think that the rise of the skinhead movement in this country and the resurgence of the Nazi Party in Germany is related to the fact that fewer and fewer of us have had that direct link with the atrocities of the war, or is it just...
I'm not sure there's a link. I think that in Nazi Germany that the older people that were SS troopers, or whether they're young or old or youngish old people, has always been there. I think that has never been given. You know, so many of them escaped to Argentina and Paraguay and other places that there's still that thing there. And then, of course, don't they call it Odessa, I believe, in the novels and some of the other things that the Odessa File, I think there was a book by that. And they still protect their own. And there have been Nazis in German government for a long time. And as a matter of fact, Rotary tried to have a Nazi president one time, and I'm one of the people that wired I stood up in our own Coeur d'Alene Rotary, and we had 4 people who did not want me to do this, but I wired them. I said, if this happens, you can expect a mass resignation from this little club in Coeur d'Alene. We're not going to have an SS trooper, former SS trooper, as an international Rotary president. They got calls and letters and telegrams from all over the world, and they didn't make that person the president. He didn't make it.
It's obvious, Ray, what you're saying is that vigilance is part of this whole process. And recently in this country, David Duke, I believe is his name, who led a portion of the Klan for a long time, came out first in a primary, and the general election's not been held yet, or at the time of the taping of this program, in Louisiana. So even, and I get reports from around the country from organizations that show when Klan members and others run for office, fortunately they've not been winning, but they get some votes. And so how would you respond to make recommendations to our viewers of how do you keep the vigilance going now to remind people?
Well, I think they get involved with organizations that you're involved with, for one thing. And then secondly, they let their elected officials know that they don't approve of certain things that are going on in areas and in communities, and they do the very best they can to communicate that. And I think, for example, Senator Blackbird's bill, even though I didn't agree with all of it, and I hadn't read it thoroughly, but the philosophy behind the bill, it was defeated by 6-5 vote in that committee. The philosophy behind the bill is very I like and adhere to and accept that. The problem isn't about that. We have to be careful about we don't infringe upon civil rights of those people, of those felons who have been cleared and are now back in the mainstream of society. But that sort of action is very important. I think also, Tony, that in my viewpoint, that we should be no different than the Jewish families. I think that we people, as white Christians, liberal or conservative, doesn't matter. We ought to celebrate Crystal Night too and be aware of what took place, and we ought to have some ceremonies to keep reminding our young people, hey, this can happen. It can happen here, and it can happen in our area, I assume, within certain limitations. And that again, it becomes a very controversial sort of thing. You know, we in our looking at skinheads from the city viewpoint in our task force, discovered that most skinheads are out of families of hippies. That's a very interesting statistical thing that we discovered. And secondly, the danger of the skinheads is their propensity for absolute violence without forethought. I mean, it's spontaneous type violence. So we have that sort of problem. But Tony, I'm saying, to answer your question, we just have to be really, we have to let young people know so that they know. And I think good education, good teaching techniques, and that taking time to talk about, to celebrate Martin Luther King Day, one of the greatest things to keep our civil rights movement, to let us know. And for example, I just discovered today that on the state marriage license in the state of Idaho, the affidavit, you have to declare race. I think that's stupid. I think it's outmoded. It should not be there. And you know, they tell us all kinds of irrational reasons why it should be there. That sort of thing we have to take charge of and not let happen.
With that, we have to close our program, but I want to thank you for the kind of leadership you show on this issue, and you certainly have never hesitated to speak out, and as we do the things we do in this part of the United States, you have always to tell people to have vigilance, and we thank you for that. And we also thank you for being here and helping us with this very serious series, and you have been very informative.
Thank you very much. Appreciate being here. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, I thank you for being with us today, and we will be continuing this series next week. It will be the 6th week in our series, and it will be our last guest. And then after that, we will have a 7th program where we will summarize all those 6 weeks and what we have talked about. I would like to invite you to be with us again next week at the same time. And until then, please have a good week. I am Tony Stewart.
North Idaho College Public Forum can be seen at the same time each week over this station. This production was videotaped earlier by an NIC student crew for viewing at this more appropriate time.